If you thought the pandemic was the black swan of the decade, think again. Live from New York City, I'm Lauren Goodwin, and this is Market Matters from New York Life Investments. Welcome, everybody. It's the week of February 28th, 2022, and I doubt any of us have done much more than watch in astonishment as Russia invaded Ukraine in this past week. So I'm thrilled to bring a special guest to our program to help us unpack what is a rapidly evolving and highly strategically important situation. John Sitilides is a Washington, D.C.-based geopolitical strategist, government affairs specialist, and diplomacy coordinator for the U.S. Department of State under contract. John's analysis of global risk trends and geopolitical strategies allows him, and frankly us as well, to explore complex political and geoeconomic decisions that are impacting global markets as we speak. John and I work together regularly on topics of geopolitical risk and their impacts to investors. He's a great friend to New York Life Investments and is always keeping us on our toes to better understand, anticipate, and mitigate risk. John, thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
Well, it's great to be with you, Lauren. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we're certainly lucky to have you. I'd like to spend a bit of time on our program today on the true geopolitics of this ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And then we'll discuss some of the potential implications as well. Starting with the geopolitics, I think that many were doubtful, rewinding a couple weeks, that Russia would move forward with a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now that the invasion has happened, it's left people wondering why. So that's my first question for you. What is Russia looking to achieve here?
Lauren, it's a very important question because we need to understand the context of what's been happening here and what will likely play out for weeks, if not months ahead. And this really began with a speech that Vladimir Putin gave at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 when he announced that he thought that Europe's security architecture was improperly being implemented and that Russia was being denied a say in how to secure Europe and that its own security interests were being ignored by the United States and the West. There have been a number of speeches since then, including some just several weeks ago. But I do agree with you that the scale and scope of this invasion did come as a surprise to many military strategists. But I would posit there are several goals here for Putin. One is, of course, as I just mentioned, to ensure that Russia has an equal say in determining the future security architecture of Europe. And that involves, for instance, no more NATO expansion along Russia's borders, as took place when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined the NATO alliance, and as NATO has been speaking since 2008 to try to bring in both Ukraine and Georgia. And that is not going to happen. These are red line issues for Vladimir Putin. And he's made that very clear by, taking a high-risk gamble and invading Ukraine. But I think in the longer term, the question is going to be what exactly are his strategic objectives in Ukraine? And what will the outcome look like if his military operations succeed? And there's probably three options here, Lauren, that we're looking at. One is full invasion and control of all of Ukraine and essential annexation of the entire country into Russia. That is going to be the highest risk, the most difficult to achieve. And we see already that there are some severe challenges that the Russian military is facing in overtaking the entire country. A second option is to dismember the country and to have Russia simply take over the eastern and southern regions as it has control since 2014. Include the central region of Kiev because he wants that capital. This is an imperial design that Vladimir Putin has laid out for Ukraine because he sees it as part of Russia's civilizational history. So Kiev must come back into the Russian fold, and he may look to do so by annexing central and southeastern Ukraine and leaving a rump Western Ukrainian state that would essentially be a cousin of Belarus, a buffer zone between Russia's western borders and the NATO alliance. And third, if the military operations go very, very badly, he may be forced back to the table and accept the withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine, but put in an effort to try to secure not necessarily a puppet government, but a government that will be very mindful of Russian interests, that will not pursue NATO membership or EU membership for Ukraine, that will not engage in any foreign policy activities that are hostile to Russia, essentially become what we call a Finlandized, neutralized buffer zone between Russia's current Western borders and the NATO alliance.
Wow, John, that was a tour de force already. I have a couple of follow-up thoughts to that. The first is that for our listeners, as we are recording this around noon Eastern time on Monday, February 28th. So all three of these scenarios are open. I think that any of them could be plausible. And so we'll be monitoring those closely in line with what you've described. The second thing that comes to mind in response to what you said is that 2007, that first speech that you referenced, it's a long time ago. So why do you see Russia taking these actions now as opposed to before or even later than now?
Well, Russia has engaged in limited military operations with sort of lower scale ambitions since 2008. If we recall, it was during the Summer Olympics of 2008 that Russian forces moved into the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, which is sandwiched between Russia, Turkey, and Azerbaijan in the Caucasus Mountain region. They recognized two breakaway republics, and Russian troops still occupy Georgia and those two republics for the last 14 years. In 2014, they moved into eastern Ukraine with their separatists, the Moscow-backed separatists, and they annexed Crimea. So what we're seeing today, Lauren, really is not simply, but a major escalation of a war in Ukraine that began 8 years ago. And that war has been unending. It's just that the U.S. media hasn't been covering it very much in recent years, again, because we've now crossed a threshold in terms of the scale and scope of Russian military operations. But I think what Vladimir Putin saw in Europe prior to the invasion was a Europe that had been severely weakened by its own policies. You have countries such as Germany and the Netherlands that have very strong pacifist strains in major political parties. And Putin's impression was probably that they were not going to be willing to risk a possible war with Russia over Ukraine. You also had very deliberate policies by a number of European countries to pursue very ambitious energy transition policies, moving from dependence on oil and natural gas to renewables. But the problem was during this transition period of the last 10 to 15 years, Europe in many ways has become more dependent on Russia for oil and for natural gas. And so this very ambitious climate policy proclaimed by politicians really didn't converge with the actual reality on the ground in terms of energy markets and the ability of European societies to develop an infrastructure, to develop a baseload using renewables rather than hydrocarbons and building the new transmission lines that are required to replace the hydrocarbon infrastructure. So as long as Europe was going to be energy dependent on Russia, and you had pacifist strains that were not willing to go to war or to ramp up their military defense capabilities, I think Putin saw a major window of opportunity to strike now before the West, especially under the Trump and Biden administrations, were arming Ukraine in a way that would bolster its defenses against any military operation in the future. So as that window of opportunity to exert military control over parts over all of Ukraine were narrowing, he believed the time to strike was now. And remember also that Ukraine is not a member of the NATO alliance. And it's why there really has been no crossing of the border into Ukraine to defend Ukraine against Russian military assaults. What we're seeing here is mostly on-the-ground movement through trucks and small vehicles to try to bolster the Ukrainian military that may be ramped up in the days and weeks ahead. But there's no legal obligation to support Ukraine, and calls for operations such as a no-fly zone are absolute deal breakers, because that means that the Russians will start to shoot American and European planes out of the sky, and that's World War III. And we don't want to go there.
Well, what you've done in your response, John, is illustrate just how high the stakes of this conflict are for Russia, Ukraine, for the world. And one of the things that you and I have discussed, even just in our conversations in the past few days, is that is one of the major differences in this conflict compared to the many other ongoing conflicts globally, is just how large not only the conflict reigns in the eyes of the West and of the NATO alliance, but also in some of these European nations strategic goals for the future, including that of combating climate change. So it's really a high stakes situation. And transitioning our conversation a bit, one of the responses, since, as you mentioned, military or no-fly zone type responses seem absolute no-goes, the West has engaged in sanctions of various Russian institutions, companies, activities. What do you perceive the intention or the impacts of those sanctions to be? And I'll just acknowledge that even this is an unfolding scenario. So maybe we can focus on their impact to the Russian and global economic growth.
There's a very important issue that you raise here, Lauren, in that Putin is largely immune from concern about public opinion around the world. And so the extent to which he has become even more of an international pariah is probably somebody that's already baked into his own thinking. So that's not really a tool that's available to the West. So there are two instruments here. One is, as we just mentioned, providing defensive and now offensive weapon systems to the Ukrainians without NATO militaries becoming directly involved in the fighting, but also the economic sanctions. And it's a very interesting sort of play here by the U.S. and by Europe, because we have seen over the last several days since the beginning of the war, a ramping up of the sanctions. And my own sense is that at the beginning of the war, literally the first day, 2 days, 3 days, there was a sense that Russia's overpowering military would achieve a fait accompli in Ukraine. And then it would be a matter of, okay, how do we negotiate what's to be done with Ukraine after the military has achieved its objectives? And that's clearly not the case. And the Ukrainian resistance has been very, very strong. And so you have now the West coming together to push on the economic sanctions and the financial sanctions and the trade sanctions far harder than they had originally conceived the first 48 hours of this operation. But they're still somewhat limited. They're greater than they were originally. But even if we look at the SWIFT sanctions, the cutoffs of the Russian banks, now what is important is the Russian central bank has been cut off from SWIFT, which renders $640 billion in foreign exchange reserves almost worthless right now, because if they can't transact those foreign currencies, there's not much point to it. The $140 billion sovereign wealth fund is still available to help cushion the blow to the Russian economy. But I think that the Russians feel that this is a far more severe sanction than they anticipated this early in the war. And you may see a run on banks by Russian citizens. Unfortunately, it's always the citizens that suffer, not so much the political, military, or business leaders of a country in war. And so you will probably have hyperinflation that will affect 100 million Russian citizens. You may also see severe disruptions in exports of wheat. Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of wheat around the world, and also obviously of natural resources such as oil, natural gas, and the like. The question is going to be, does China have a role to play here in helping to cushion the blow to Russia's economy, because they've developed their cross-border international payment system as an alternative to the SWIFT system of dollar-denominated trade messaging. And we can go into that in a later question, but I think that's going to be a very important question here also. And I would add one more thing here. It's interesting that the SWIFT sanctions have been imposed on almost every aspect of Russia's trade except energy. So Europe continues not only to buy oil and natural gas from the country that it is now looking to severely punish economically and financially, but Lauren, in fact, over the last 6 to 7 days, Europe has actually increased its natural gas purchases from Russia. And the United States, which through 2020 was energy independent from Russian energy, now purchases almost 600,000 barrels of oil a day. About 7% of U.S. imports come from Russia. And we're also buying large amounts of coal from Russia, even as we are now leading the international effort to try to defeat Russia economically, financially, and eventually militarily in Ukraine.
Wow, it's a complex picture, the butterfly effect that sanctions have, and the complex way in which they are imposed or not imposed, to your point, is fascinating. And we can see why we've seen a fair bit of market volatility in the last several days as investors try to assess the different impacts, not only to Russian institutions, but global institutions, companies, margins, the energy sector, et cetera. It's it's astonishingly complex. And I do want to take you up on your offer to come back to some of those points around China. But before we do so, you talked a little bit about SWIFT, which is a transaction system that's used globally, and about the alternatives that China has been setting up alongside the U.S. and global financial institutions here. One of the questions we've been getting a lot from our client base and our audience has to do with, do sanctions like this increase China's weight in the international system, or perhaps by contrast, reduce U.S. weight in the international system? Is it a risk for the U.S. to contribute to these sanctions if it means, less use of the U.S. dollar in the future, just as an example?
Well, this is where we bring together geopolitics and geoeconomics, or geofinance, Lauren, if you will. I would say in the immediate term, what we see happening with foreign exchanges and foreign currencies is that U.S. retains its primacy on the world stage, the U.S. dollar, that is. And that is why the sanctions are going to be extremely painful for Russia. But I would also add that Russia and China have both been preparing for years for the development of alternative parallel transaction messaging systems so that they are not beholden to a U.S. dominated system, as is SWIFT, where about $400 billion in messaging transactions takes place every day, 400 billion, whereas under this new CIPS, the cross-border international payment system that China developed in 2015 and is now fully operational, it's a significant amount, $50 billion worth of messaging transactions a day, but nothing yet near SWIFT. But China could make this CIPS program available to Russia to help Russia circumvent the SWIFT sanctions. But we'll look to see to what extent Beijing is looking to move that quickly to align itself with Russia, when China itself is very much concerned down the road, about possible U.S.-led sanctions against China if and when it might invade Taiwan or engage in a serious political, economic, and diplomatic strangulation of Taiwan, and whether or not there's a sanctions response. So China wants to be ready for that, just as Russia has tried to prepare itself for the response from the global West regarding the invasion of Ukraine. But I think in the short term, Beijing is very much concerned that Chinese banks that would be involved in helping Russia to circumvent SWIFT might suffer under U.S. secondary sanctions. And the Chinese are not ready to have their banks suffer under U.S.-led sanctions. It's not a time for China to be able to declare its financial independence from the U.S.-led system yet. But one other concern to keep in mind there is it probably is not even in the U.S. or European interest anytime soon to impose secondary sanctions on Chinese banks, even if they were to be facilitating the Russians, because the disruption to global supply chains that originate in China or pass through China would be colossal. And we would be imposing considerable self-inflicted damage on the American and European economies if we disrupted those global supply chains starting in or passing through China. So it's an extraordinarily complex financial minefield. Please pardon the pun, given the context of war that we're talking about, but it just gives you a sense of how high the stakes are short-term, intermediate, and long-term.
Well, it's, again, just painting a picture of an extremely complex web of interests and events. For what it's worth, for our audience, my perspective, which aligns with yours, John, is that the U.S. dollar is so entrenched in the global financial system that it's ebbing and flowing as a result of, in importance, as a result of events like this is highly unlikely, but that the increasing importance of China and Chinese-led institutions and systems is more or less inevitable, just as a function of the size and importance of that economy. And so from an investment perspective, we don't see any immediate impacts of the dollar supremacy as a topic per se, but it's something that, as long as I've been employed, has been top of mind for investors. So we'll continue to track it. Speaking in terms of these big global transitions, John, I do want to come back to the point about Europe's energy transition, because many analysts have made the point that, this is the event that's going to drive Europe to accelerate its green energy transition. Of course, a source of conversation and force from the European economy even before this began. I'm a bit skeptical of this, not to say that it's not a valid point, but Russian ambitions in the former Soviet bloc have been clear and ongoing for many years, and neither incursions in Georgia nor Crimea were enough to accelerate this action. And so for all the reasons that you laid out earlier with respect to energy availability, I see a strong acceleration of Europe's green energy transition as potentially unrealistic in, a 10-year term. What do you think?
Energy scarcity in Europe is a deliberate policy choice by European political leaders. And again, this strategy began 10, 15, maybe 20 years ago with very ambitious proclamations by European politicians to accelerate the transition to renewables. Now, you could do this in 2000, in 2005, in 2010, 2015, maybe even 2020, Lauren, when Europe believed that it was prospering and flourishing and transitioning in a landscape of relative security, serenity, and shared prosperity across the continent. And this invasion of Ukraine has jarred the minds and the thinking of European leaders because it makes them realize that if your security as a nation and as a continent is at risk, climate policies can be somewhat of a luxury rather than a necessity. And I think it's very important, not only in Europe, but also here in the United States under the Biden administration, we see a very significant change of direction in terms of environmental regulations and the impact on the hydrocarbon industry in the US, so that we have an administration that places climate policy as the priority across the entire range of legislative and regulatory priorities in the United States. And we've seen that in Europe. And my concern now is that the real world has sort of shattered many of those ambitions, many of those aspirations. And yes, climate policy is very important for the long run, for the well-being of countries and of societies, not only in the advanced world, but especially in the developing world, where there are 1 billion people today who have zero access to electricity in any given day of the year. But now we have to decide the trade-off between national security and climate policy. And in almost every serious instance of strategic thinking by a political leader, national security must trump climate policy. It's simply that simple, that straightforward. And so I think what Russia has done and will continue to do is to remind Europe that the transition can take place, but it probably needs to be on an adjusted timeline, because Europe has made itself dependent on Russian oil and natural gas. And may I add, Lauren, that was a deliberate policy choice by former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who believed that greater interdependence between Russia and Germany, or Russia and the European Union, would reduce tensions and allow for mutual flourishing of their economies. And much as we in Washington over the last 20 years believe that welcoming China into the World Trade Organization and engaging in more trade and building up China's economy would lead Beijing in a freer and more liberalized direction, and now they're our number one geopolitical enemy to a degree greater than we've known at any time in the last 40 years. So I think Europe miscalculated with its energy policies. And I do think, not immediately, because right now the urgency and the focus is on the war and deconflicting the war. But I think in the short term, you'll start to see a number of lawmakers engage in a more robust debate in Europe about how to deaccelerate the transition in a more realistic direction. And this is potentially going to rupture a number of political establishments in Europe, because the very strong pro-climate policy bias among many European citizens is overwhelming. And I don't know how political leaders balance what they think is the long-term interest of their respective nations with a very restive population that wants to move faster towards climate transition and towards renewables replacing oil and natural gas. So it's going to be a fascinating political debate in many European countries for years to come.
Well, it's not only a fascinating debate for years to come, but also has major implications for some of the themes that we discuss the most, even before this conflict, with respect to inflation and the impacts of any acceleration in the green energy transition on prices, on assets, et cetera, which is something for our listeners that we'll come back to shortly. John, you've already been so generous with your time, but I want to ask just one more question, diving in on something that you've mentioned with respect to China and the balance of strategic objectives that China is making here as well. I've seen several analysts point to China as a potential strategic winner of Russia's decision to invade Ukraine, almost no matter how it goes or which of the scenarios that you outlined earlier ends up being the one that transpires. What do you make of that comment? You know, China is a long-term strategic thinker. Is this moment in time a win for them or a benefit for them in any way?
Lauren, I will offer a contrarian response and admit that I don't know. And the fact is, nobody knows. We're still very much eyeballs deep in a horrific war in Ukraine. And we don't know whether or not it will expand into Europe, into NATO. We just don't know what's going to happen. The outcome of the war is so completely uncertain today, one cannot with any confidence make any serious prediction here. But what we can look at here is what are China's short-term and long-term interests vis-a-vis Russia. And that's a constant in many ways, regardless of the war. And I would state that in the short term, I would posit that China has an interest in Russia prevailing as effectively and as successfully as possible, because if you recall, the first day of the Beijing Olympics just a few weeks ago, China and Russia issued a very lengthy joint statement, essentially challenging the rules-based liberal international order that we've known for the last 30 years and asserting their independence from a U.S. and European Union-led system and looking to see how they accelerate the transformation of the global order into one that takes China's and Russia's interests and ambitions far more seriously than they have felt has been the case to date. So the degree to which Russia continues to push back against the global West in Europe right now and is able to achieve its geostrategic ambitions in Ukraine and in Eurasia, I think China feels that it will see its own interests advance as well, given that China and Russia today are seen largely as shoulder to shoulder. So a strong Russia right now, I believe, is in China's interest. However, in the long term, China wants to see a weakened Russia. Remember that China and Russia actually went to war in the early 1960s and were major rivals during most of the Cold War. That was the basis for Nixon's opening to China in the early 1970s to play the China card against the Soviet Union. They are both rivals for dominance of the Eurasian continent in one capacity or another. And what China, I think, would like to see is a not militarily neutralized Russia, but one that no longer in any way could ever threaten China along their very lengthy border in northern China, or to minimize Russia's power projection capabilities and influence in Central Asia, across which pass all of this massive new infrastructure connectivity between China and the Middle East and Europe. So diminishing Russia's power in Central Asia and north of China is very important, so long as China continues to be on the receiving end of Russia's abundant natural resources. Energy, of course, oil, natural gas, and coal, timber, diamonds, critical metals, rare earths. China is going to continue to depend on Russia for safe and secure overland supplies as an alternative to still what is considered to be a U.S.-led shipping lane system around the world, which China feels it is very vulnerable to. So interesting how this will play out short-term and long-term, but I really would be sort of reserved about applying the outcome of the war or the current pace of the war in the context of how China may prevail or not. Its longer-term interests remain the same no matter what happens with this conflict.
Well, John, it is certainly a hectic time to be an expert in geopolitics and geoeconomics, but what you've done is illustrate just how long these events and these conflicts and how interlinked they are and how relevant they are at all times. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for taking some time out of your schedule to join us today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you and your audience, Lauren. Again, thank you very much for having me.
I'll now transition to our Portfolio Pause, a segment of the program where we share an investment idea. And today, in light of all the uncertainty out there, we're focused on resiliency. This crisis in Ukraine is evolving rapidly, and with it, so are investor expectations for international relations, commodity prices, inflation, the corporate operating environment, company margins, and so many more factors. That said, we've already seen some market reaction to the initial surprise of the invasion. And so in our view, there's little benefit to adjusting a portfolio after the fact for a risk that's already been taking place. In fact, exiting positions during moments of market stress is a common means of destroying long-term wealth. And even more than that, this geopolitical risk is not unfolding in a vacuum. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is certainly one of the most meaningful geopolitical events in decades, but it's also taking place alongside a global transition away from a 2-year pandemic and in a time of unprecedented monetary policy unwind. Both of these global factors are clear drivers of the economy and markets ahead. So with this in mind, we're mainly encouraging investors to stay calm and to keep their long-term goals in mind. That said, in an effort to share genuine portfolio ideas, we see 5 key actions that can help keep portfolios on track amid this uncertainty. This is our honest geopolitical risk playbook laid out for you, our listeners. So first, focus on action, not distraction. Geopolitical events understandably contribute to investor fear, but keep in mind there's always a reason or multiple reasons to take money off the table. But cash can be a significant drag on a portfolio, especially in an environment when inflation is rising. So stay focused on long-term investment goals and make allocation changes only when the key market drivers for an investor's time horizon have shifted. Now, that may be the case in this event, but it's important to keep in mind those drivers of a portfolio. Second, and speaking of a period where inflation is rising, keep the broader investment environment in mind. Exogenous events tend to reinforce pre-existing economic trends more than changing the tenor of the markets as a whole. So that means themes like inflation, which may be bolstered by the threat of higher energy prices during this crisis, as well as central bank tightening, are firm in our mind. So from an investment perspective, that means asset classes tied to global economic growth and inflation. So quality value stocks, small caps, short duration, and floating rate fixed income instruments remain some of our favorites for the time being. Third idea, maintain a diversified portfolio. By diversifying across regions and sectors and asset classes, investors can reduce exposure to idiosyncratic or one-off or unexpected risks in certain regions or sectors of the world economy. Fourth, investors with the appropriate time horizon and risk tolerance could consider targeted geopolitical hedges. Geopolitical risks often manifest via currency volatility, just as one example, or commodity price changes. Investors could consider a 50% currency hedge strategy or targeted commodities exposure as a means of generating portfolio resiliency as those risks unfold. And finally, our last idea, consider building resiliency by using active managers in a portfolio, because given geopolitical, monetary, and fiscal policy risks this year, we're encouraging working with managers who can quickly and flexibly navigate the numerous and sometimes competing impacts to the investment environment. It's always difficult to time markets and to know exactly what will happen next. And so working with managers who have navigated multiple geopolitical risks or economic cycles can help to generate resiliency against those risks as they occur. Coming up next, I mentioned earlier that none of this geopolitical stuff is happening in a vacuum, and I meant it, because on Friday, the Bureau of Labor Statistics will publish the jobs report for February. While investors, including us, expect the Federal Reserve to begin raising interest rates in March, this data will provide an important input to whether a 25 basis point or 0.25% move or a 50 basis point move is more likely. The markets expect 1.75% or 175 basis points worth of hikes this year, whereas Fed speakers and speeches often point to fewer hikes. So any surprises on how the labor market is developing, which we might see in this Friday's report, could contribute to the volatility that we're already seeing in the markets, particularly in interest rates. That's it for today. We'll be back next week with more Market Matters. In the meantime, if you have a question or topic of interest, reach out to us on LinkedIn. You can also follow our views on NewYorkLifeInvestments.com and click the Insights tab. Until then, I'm Lauren Goodwin. See you next time.